All right, what's going on, you guys? Nick here with Nick on the Powers. I want to talk about a critical moment in bodybuilding history and really sports history in general, and that is the Anabolic Steroids Control Act of 1990. So this was a bill that was passed that, had it been really effective, it could have changed bodybuilding forever, but it really didn't. So the Anabolic Steroids Control Act of 1990, the goal of this was to establish penalties for physical trainers or advisors who endeavor to persuade or induce individuals to possess or use anabolic steroids. The second goal of this was to add anabolic steroids as a Schedule III substance under such act. And the third goal was to define anabolic steroid as any drug or hormonal substance that promotes muscle growth in a manner pharmacologically similar to testosterone, including specified substances. And then if you go in and actually read the text of this bill, they actually have a list in there of everything they would consider to be an anabolic steroid. I'm not going to read every single thing on here, but some things that might stick out to you guys. Testosterone is on that list. Trenbolone is on that list. And then they go on to say any salt, ester, or isomer of a drug substance described or listed in this paragraph if that salt, ester, or isomer promotes muscle growth. So the goal of this bill was to really crack down and criminalize the use and distribution of steroids, and provide specific criminal penalties for the use of the steroids, and really break down the specifics of what they consider to be anabolic steroids. So the reason why this is important is because this could have had a lasting effect on professional bodybuilding, and it could have really changed how professional bodybuilding operated from that point forward. And we could have been looking at a completely different version of professional bodybuilding had they been completely compliant with this law. Now, as a direct result of this bill, in 1990, the IFBB, for the first time ever, drug tested both the Arnold Classic and the Mr. Olympia competition, the two biggest competitions in bodybuilding. And they actually enforced it very, very strictly that year in 1990. Not only did they drug test the athletes, but they did ban athletes who failed the drug test. Now, interestingly enough, at the 1990 Mr. Olympia, all 20 competitors were drug tested, but the IFBB officials did not tell the competitors what drugs they were testing for. So it's really still unknown what exactly the competitors were disqualified for, what exactly they failed on, because it was never really made clear what was being tested for. So at the 1990 Mr. Olympia, Lee Haney won, which I believe was his 7th consecutive Mr. Olympia title. Lee Labrada took second, and Sean Ray managed to take third place. Now, the interesting thing about Sean Ray placing third here and passing the drug test was that earlier that year was when the Arnold Classic was drug tested. And Sean Ray actually won that 1990 Arnold Classic, but after winning, it was discovered that he didn't pass the drug test. So he was actually forced to forfeit that title, the trophy, the prize money to Mike Ashley, who did pass the drug test, which was very controversial at this time because it was kind of still common knowledge amongst the bodybuilding community that anabolic steroids were clearly used in the sport to achieve these physiques. And then all these years had passed that the Mr. Olympia had been held, no drug testing, all these bodybuilding shows, no drug testing. Then in 1990, they tried to set this new precedent of drug testing. And the result of that was not really a good one. A lot of people felt that the physiques at the 1990 Mr. Olympia were not as impressive as they usually were. They were downsized, the conditioning wasn't as good, and it wasn't as big of a draw as it was before the drug testing. And in addition to that, you had a lot of disgruntled IFBB competitors, like Sean Ray, for example. I'm sure losing that Arnold Classic title was probably one of the worst memories of his entire pro bodybuilding career, and probably left a pretty sour taste in his mouth. And then all the other competitors that had been disqualified from the 90 Olympia and the 90 Arnold Classic, I'm sure they weren't too happy with this new rule as well, because again, everyone probably had the understanding this is what everybody's doing. Everybody's using this stuff. But for whatever reason, I wasn't smart enough, or I couldn't get away with it, and I didn't pass a drug test, so now I'm being punished, when it's pretty clear everybody else is doing this. So the reason I say this could have changed bodybuilding forever is because had they kept this strict policy of drug testing every competitor at the Mr. Olympia, we could have seen bodybuilding go in an entirely different direction than it obviously has gone. We could have seen drug testing every year. We could have seen much smaller bodybuilders, a much more focused approach on aesthetics and downsized physiques. Even if guys were cheating to pass the drug test, it would be a lot harder to come in as a mass monster and compete at the Olympia, or win the Olympia, if these drug tests were still in place. I think the drug test could have been a good thing, but at the same time, I think it really would have been a controversial and hypocritical thing, because at the end of the day, I think these pro bodybuilders would have found a way, regardless, to use drugs and get away with it, some type of drugs, and get away with it. So it still would have been the same issue. It just would have been probably downsized guys. So immediately following 1990, the drug testing went away. The rest of the Mr. Olympias were not drug tested. The rest of the Arnold Classics were not drug tested. And then as a result, you had guys like Dorian Yates winning the Olympia, Ronnie Coleman winning the Olympia, Marcus Rule competing at the Olympia. And the physiques actually started to get bigger and bigger and freakier rather than going in a drug-tested natural direction, which is a very interesting dynamic to me. Now, to make things even more interesting, even though the drug testing clearly isn't there at the Olympia or any professional show for that matter, if you go to the official IFBB rulebook, if you go down to Article 12, they still claim to have doping controls in place. And in that Article 12, they claim to conform to the World Anti-Doping Agency, or the WADA code. They say they reserve the right to randomly drug test any athlete, target test any athlete, both in and out of competition, which, even though this is in the rule book, it's clearly something that's not enforced to any degree today. So for whatever reason, the IFBB kind of got lucky here, and they kind of avoided any scrutiny or backlash as a result of this 1990 law. Now, Vince McMahon, however, wasn't so lucky. So Vince McMahon, tried to capitalize on the 1990 Mr. Olympia being less popular and less exciting because of the drug testing. And he knew a lot of those athletes had been disgruntled from the IFBB because of the failed drug test. And he wanted to bring them over, offer them more money, offer them a better place to compete. So he created his own bodybuilding organization, the WBF, in 1991, holding his first WBF World Championships.
All these bodybuilders are making more money. They got signed to more money than any of the top wrestlers were making.
You're kidding.
No, they all got made, and they all got paid out full contract. Like when it folded, they all got paid out. Every one of them, all those bodybuilders. Stryden, isn't that his name? Stridix or something like that. Name.
But and now, could you pick a worse time to launch a bodybuilding federation than when you were going to begin testing people for steroids?
It was a failed, doomed enterprise right from the. Who wants to watch bodybuilders that are not on steroids? I mean.
And he did try to sign guys like Sean Ray, who were clearly disgruntled with the IFBB and had failed the drug tests. And they did end up signing Aaron Baker, Mike Christian, Vince Comerford, David Dirth, Barry DeMay, Johnny Morant, Danny Padilla, Tony Pearson, Jim Quinn, Mike Quinn, Eddie Robinson, and Gary Stridham, who would win both the 1991 and 1992 WBF World Championships. So basically what Vince McMahon tried to do was implement a level of excitement into bodybuilding and try to give these bodybuilders a character and a performance and a routine similar to how you would view professional wrestling, and it just did not work out. And in 1992, he implemented a drug testing policy at the WBF. Now, this led to bodybuilders not only looking not their best, but this led to bodybuilders looking borderline horrible on stage. And I think that, in addition to kind of the corny characters and gimmicks that he gave these bodybuilders, was a major reason why the WBF ended up failing, is because the caliber of competition looked horrible by the time the 1992 WBF World Championships came around. And I think a lot of that had to do with him drug testing these guys, trying to stay compliant with that new 1990 steroid law. Now, to make things even more fascinating, after that 1992 WBF World Championships, Vince disbanded the WBF, and then just a couple months later was when Vince McMahon was indicted on charges of distributing steroids to professional wrestlers, which I think was also a direct result of that 1990 steroid law. So this is why I say this law was a major moment in bodybuilding history, because this law really could have entirely crippled the IFBB. It could have completely brought it down, and it almost brought down Vince McMahon, who obviously had a lot more money and a lot more power, arguably, than the Weider brothers or the IFBB ever had. Now, this trial was really a big deal, and a lot of people have forgotten about it already. But back then, Vince McMahon was facing some pretty big charges. He wasn't just charged with looking the other way while wrestlers obviously took steroids. He was charged with actually obtaining the steroids and then giving them to the guys and encouraging them to take the steroids. Now, obviously, the record will show that Vince McMahon was acquitted on all charges, and ever since then, the WWE wellness policy has been a lot stricter than it has been in the past.
The message, don't do drugs. That's why when you see this symbol, you can be assured of drug-free sports entertainment that you and your entire family.
While there are still clearly some wrestlers that are using anabolic steroids on the roster today, they certainly have cracked down, or at least made it seem that they've cracked down on their wellness policy, drug use, recreational drug use, or anabolic. And this incident back in 1992, 1993 really did end up changing professional wrestling forever. And like I said, it could have ended up completely crippling professional wrestling. It could have ended up being the end of Vince McMahon, had this gone south. And some people say this whole steroid controversy was one of the main reasons that the WBF ended up not working out and ended up being disbanded, was because Vince McMahon was afraid of, possible further scrutiny, because he now had a stable of bodybuilders in addition to the stable of wrestlers that looked good and were, clearly had great physiques. He now had all these bodybuilders signed to him that, how are they getting these physiques that were even better than what the wrestlers had? So I just thought this would make an interesting topic for a video. This law, really, like I said, could have changed everything. Vince McMahon really got hit pretty hard by it. And I think the IFBB really could have gotten hit pretty hard by it, and it could have changed bodybuilding forever, like I said. But somehow, ironically, bodybuilding went in the entire opposite direction. And now, today, we have bigger bodybuilders than we've ever had before, probably taking more stuff than they've ever taken in the history of bodybuilding. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Please give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Make sure you subscribe to my channel if you have not already. Thank you guys for watching. Nick Strength and Power, signing out.